You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are featuring Dr. Benjamin Schaffer. He is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina and is carving out a niche for himself in the role of the Navies in the New World. Historyman has bumped into him on numerous occasions at different ceremonies and celebrations across South Carolina. Dr. Schaffer is always engaging and invited us to record a recent talk that he gave at the Revolutionary War Visitor Center in Camden, South Carolina. He loves to travel and speak in front of audiences. You can reach him at schafferhistorian@gmail.com. That's schafferhistorian@gmail.com.
Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you to the Revolutionary Visitor Center for having me. It's a great honor to be here to discuss my work with you. I want to speak with you today about 18th century naval history that predates the U.S. Navy. For those who have been following the trajectory of the 250th anniversaries, the U.S. Navy just had its 250th anniversary of its founding. I was actually in Philadelphia for it in October the 13th. So we are looking today at the prequel of that event. So we're actually going to talk very little about the American Revolution today. We're going colonial, and I hope this helps kind of set the scene for the rise of the Continental Navy. So this is the prequel series for those of you who are Star Wars fans. My book is a product of my dissertation from grad school, which has been significantly shortened down and made less jargony, I hope. And the book looks at the ways that the British institution of building local navies traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and was used by colonists throughout the American colonies and the Caribbean to defend their shores from pirates, from the Spanish, the French, and various Native Americans who at times could be not just threats on land but on sea as well, which is something that not a lot of people are familiar with. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So you have to forgive my funny clothes in this picture. I do, when I'm not teaching at USC, do Revolutionary War reenacting, and that's been the fact of the matter since I was a small child. And the first employer I had was in Charleston at the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. Has anyone been there before in Charleston? It's a pirate dungeon. It's a Revolutionary War prison. When I was 18 years old in college, most normal people go to work at Publix for their first job. My job, of course, was working at the pirate dungeon in period clothing. And I was working there, and I noticed an exhibit that always bothered me. This is going back to my college years, so 2011 or 12. It always bothered me that this exhibit said that the pirate Stede Bonnet was captured by Colonel William Rhett. When you read that sentence, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because Colonel William Rhett is one man. He doesn't have superpowers. How can he capture an entire pirate and pirate crew? And it was a very vaguely written sentence that never sat right with me. And as college went on and I continued to work in that museum, I started to wonder who else was with William Rhett. And it turns out through research that I did into early grad school when I got into a PhD program at the University of New Hampshire, which is a culture shock for this Charleston boy living in the snow, that it turns out that he had an entire fleet with him of merchants that he had drafted or impressed to go pirate hunting. So the South Carolinians had their own provincial navy, and that's something that was so little spoken of that either it was treated as a bygone with just a sentence just talking about their commander, or it was completely forgotten. So that bothered me, and that little bit of being a grammarian, I guess, served me well because it helped me discover a topic that I feel like hadn't been talked about enough. So sometimes the things that bother you can help you find new topics to explore. So moving into an opening anecdote, it was the 8th year of a global war that pitted England and her colonies and indigenous allies against France and Spain and their indigenous allies and the colonists on both sides. Philadelphia, capital of the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania, was in danger. Now, I'm going to have to put on my college instructor hat for a second. I like feedback from the crowd, so y'all are going to have to forgive me. But what are the strongest beliefs of Quakers? What is their main ideology?
No fighting.
Yeah, nonviolence. Can you see why that's a problem if you've got enemies off your coast? So that creates an ideological and a political problem. Franco-Spanish privateers will ply the Delaware Bay in the final months of 1747, looking for easy pickings, and they were finding plenty of it because there was very little resistance. After all, the colonial government was nonviolent, pacifistic, and the only Royal Navy ships nearby were in New York, so not terribly far, but also not there necessarily when they needed to be. And the way the Chesapeake and the Delaware Bay works is there's plenty of inlets and shoals for privateers to hide out in. Middle-aged printer Benjamin Franklin decided to write a pamphlet in English and in German. So this is one of the first kind of multilingual pamphlets that circulates in Philadelphia, which had a big quote-unquote Pennsylvania Dutch population. It was called Plain Truth, and it attempted to convince the locals of the necessity of putting aside some of their Quaker beliefs in order to defend their coasts and to build a provincial navy. To quote Benjamin Franklin, which I always love doing, he said, quote, "Ships of war of the Royal Navy during the greatest parts of the year from both Virginia and New York, unquote, are not here when we need them. And it's important for us to, quote, bear the expense of a vessel to guard our trade," unquote. So Benjamin Franklin, the man who would later go on to be in the original committee that founded the Continental Navy in 1775, as an older man, as a middle-aged man a few decades earlier, is calling for Pennsylvania to build its own navy decades before the Revolutionary War is even a thought. So this is the kind of project I'm looking at, how the founders in the Revolutionary generation will draw on a long experience of coastal defense that was not very far off from the way the militia was the ancestor of the U.S. Army in the Revolution. There was, I argue, a foundation that they could draw on for defending their coasts. Franklin, I think needless to say, had a very hard time convincing the Quaker government to build a navy, and they didn't, but it's the idea that counts. This is a picture of, unfortunately, there's not a lot of good period images of a Spanish guardacosta who he was fearful of. This is a model from a tabletop game. That's about the best picture I could find of what he was fearful of. But you can almost imagine pirates lurking off the coast, working in honor of the Spanish monarchs. So this is where I kind of get into the nitty-gritty in terms of why should we care, in terms of terminology. One of the things that they always teach you in the history grad school is you're never going to come up with a new idea. Nothing is new under the sun, as it says in Scripture. So you got to sometimes reinterpret things. For the most part, historians have mentioned coastal defense, but what I noticed in my research is they never gave credit to the American governments of the colonies for building their own navies. Usually what historians have said is that they had privateers. And I made a little kind of spectrum here for you to kind of explain where privateers fit in. On the one far end of the legal spectrum in colonial America, you had pirates, as illustrated by Jack Sparrow right there. Pirates are, by definition, maritime predators who are acting without the realm of legal permission. And if you go on Google News, I would have my students do this when I taught a class in the golden age of piracy. You go on Google News, you type in pirate attack, you will find this week or last week, this is still going on. Even if it's not with flintlocks and it's with Kalashnikovs, it still is piracy at sea. In the middle, we don't see this as much, but technically speaking, the U.S. is one of the few countries where legally privateering is still part of our Constitution. Congress reserves the right, if you read that founding document, to issue letters of marque. What is a privateer? The not so accurate way of describing it is a government-paid pirate. That's the easy sort of History 101 way of describing it. In reality, it's a private mariner or merchant captain who's given a license to raid enemy shipping in very strict parameters. The person who's being attacked by that privateer might feel they're being attacked by pirates, but in reality, they have legal permission to do so. The U.S., technically speaking, still retains the legal right to issue letters of marque. We haven't since the Confederates did in the 1860s, and as a country, we haven't since 1812, but we could. And there has been talk of it throughout U.S. history since. And then the Royal Navy. The British Royal Navy was and is the main force of the United Kingdom's naval defense. And they had a mixed reputation in the colonies. The colony of South Carolina, which you'll have to forgive, is one I will talk the most about tonight. Hope you guys can appreciate that. But all the colonial leaders were hopeful that the Royal Navy would do most of the heavy lifting. and would come to save the day. And unfortunately, that was not always the case, and at times their relationship could be antagonistic. It could be quite unhelpful and even the opposite of helpful when they were needed. So the term provincial navy is what I use to describe when American colonial governments in South Carolina, New Hampshire, or Barbados, wherever have you, use local funds to build a naval militia. And that term has been used on and off, so I didn't create it, but I'm kind of revisiting that and trying to tell the whole story. Historians have largely only talked about privateers and the Royal Navy. They've left this kind of gap where there's a few studies here and there on individual provincial navies, but my book talks about the whole phenomenon, looking across the whole Atlantic Ocean, not just in one colony. So where does this actually come from? We have to go back to the Vikings. We have to go back to the medieval times. To look for the origins of provincial navies in America, we have to look back to the Middle Ages. In the medieval times, there was no large English Royal Navy. In fact, the last major navy that had been in the British Isles was the Romans. There was, in the warring period of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and eventually after the Norman invasion, some regional navies that were established. In fact, most of what these were just fleets put together to transport soldiers. Doing fighting at sea was very uncommon, not unheard of, but very uncommon in the Middle Ages. The way a king, let's say a king of England in the 9 or 1000s, would have gotten a navy is by sending out warrants around the port cities, including in Dover and London, to impress merchant ships, to draft them into a temporary fighting force. The crown would take over the payment of the sailors thereon, or perhaps they would even send out a press gang to look for sailors that had run away. Can you imagine this is a little controversial if you're a merchant captain? You know, time is money and money is time. And having your ship taken over by the Navy. There is no official standing force outside of a couple royal ships, and this is true for much of England's early modern history all the way through the 1500s. It won't be until the rule of King Henry VIII, who's known for having some pretty terrible life choices, but also known for creating a lot of enemies and making England a lot more isolated. He establishes a modern admiralty system. In some ways, he's called the grandfather of the Royal Navy for a reason. There were early cases of monarchs who did the same thing. Henry V will have his own small Royal Navy in the 1400s, but it drains the treasury of England. Their state is not advanced enough to have a large navy. So when does the Royal Navy get to be this large international fighting force? The late 1600s. Well after English colonization has already started. So colonists are moving to the New World before they're even sure what the Royal Navy's purpose is. And before there's even any necessary idea that there is this imperial force that might come save the day. So they're already moving to the New World with the idea that they've got to defend themselves on land and on sea, just like their ancestors had in the English Isles when fighting the French, which the British are always doing, or fighting as early as the Vikings. So that's just a little prehistory. Does anyone know which ship that is, by the way, in that picture on the right? It looks like it a little bit. It's the Mary Rose. And if you get a chance to go to Portsmouth, England, it's right next to the HMS Victory. It's one of my favorite ships. They recovered the entire thing from the 1500s, from the bottom of the English Channel. So it's definitely worth checking out if you ever get a chance to go there. So what does this look like in colonial America? Well, as I was saying, the idea of a standing British naval force that guards the whole seas is a pretty new idea in the 1600s. So when Massachusetts start to settle, the Puritans start to settle New England, really as early as the Virginians who start to settle Virginia, but by the 1630s with the creation of the New England colonies, there was this idea that they had to defend themselves and raise their own local naval forces. King Charles I, just to give you a quote, in the charter he gave to Massachusetts in 1629 said the following, quote, "At all times hereafter, for their special defense and safety, you may resist by force of arms as well by sea as by land, and by all fitting ways and means whatsoever, all such persons as shall at any time hereafter attempt or enterprise the destruction, invasion, detriment, or annoyance to the said plantation, and to take and to surprise by all ways and means whatsoever all and every such person with their ships." So it's a very legal legalistic, very wordy sentence that is telling the Massachusetts that not only should you create your own militias by land, but you should be prepared to use boats or ships to pursue enemies by water, and you have the royal blessing to do so. So rather than exhaustively going war by war and looking at every single case of a provincial navy that was built, just to give you a spoiler alert, there are hundreds. That's how I got a book out of it. But I wanted to pick some high-profile cases, some of which I think are very interesting, some of which involve things that you would not expect, including the fact that the Dutch invaded Virginia. That's something I didn't know growing up until I started researching for this project. In an early case of a provincial navy, in the 1660s, the first ever Royal Navy guard ship was sent to the New World, to the only colony on the mainland of North America that was very important to England, Virginia. Virginia was the only truly royally controlled colony by the 1660s on the North American mainland. The other places that had Royal Navy protection were sugar colonies in the Caribbean. So they're sending the Navy where the money is. That makes kind of sense if you're the British Empire and you work on a mercantilism. So they send HMS Elizabeth with her 46 guns to go and defend Williamsburg and Jamestown. And she was in very bad disrepair by the time she got to America. And she was in no way ready to defend the coast when the Dutch invade in the 1660s. Just to give you a little context, the Dutch and English weren't getting along too well at the time. The English may or may not have taken New York from them, New Amsterdam, I should say. So there's some back and forth going on in this period. The Dutch plan to invade the colony, but big problem, there is no Royal Navy frigate that can stand up to them. So Governor Berkeley, who is the namesake of our Berkeley County in South Carolina, by the way, he was also one of our Lord's proprietors, takes the merchant vessels, about 12 of them that were in town that were getting ready to carry tobacco back to England, and says, not so fast, you're not leaving. You are now going to be my Navy. You're going to be impressed. You're going to go defend us from the Dutch invasion fleet. The captains and the masters of these vessels were quite worried because what happens if their ships get damaged? Who do they have to answer to? The ship's owners back in London. They're going to get in trouble. So they asked for proof that their ships were impressed. So he goes and he actually draws a big arrow, a big upwards arrow, which is the sign of the crown. It's a sign that you are temporary or permanent royal property. He has his men carve the king's arrow on each of the masts of the ships to show the ship owners back in London that their vessels had been taken into the royal service. Are they now part of the Royal Navy? No, but they are being taken by a royal governor and made into a temporary naval militia. And one source said there were 400 men and boys on these vessels, including the crew of that defunct Royal Navy ship. This sounds like we're gearing up for a big battle of Pirates of the Caribbean, but what if I told you that all of these ships fled before they could get into any fights with the Dutch? And the Dutch had very little resistance. Berkeley and his allies called them cowards, but to be fair, these were not military men. These were, for the most part, merchant sailors who didn't want to risk their life for what? A colony that didn't belong to them. So that may seem like an anticlimactic story, but it shows you he had the means and the old-fashioned, even ancient way of building a local fleet that had dated back to the medieval times in England, and he was simply keeping that process going. And there are plenty of times where this is a very successful strategy. So the Dutch invasion maybe wasn't our brightest moment for provincial navies, but it is a moment where the provincial naval toolkit, as you might call it, is readily available. So this starts to get to be a much larger phenomenon in the period called the Imperial Wars. It's also a period known as the French and Indian Wars, and in my own research, this is my favorite time period. In fact, if you've ever seen Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis, that's the last of those. That's this one right here, French and Indian War. Scholars prefer to call it 7 Years' War just because these are all technically French and Indian Wars. There are 4 major conflicts that happen between England, France, and the Spanish, and a little bit in the Dutch, and their colonial and their Native American allies. But that's just the 4 big wars. You've got King William's War from 1689 to 1698, Queen Anne's War, you can tell these are named after the people who were in office, which runs from 1702 to 1713. And you get this big gap. You think that it's a halftime show. It's not. It's when the golden age of piracy happens. The killing doesn't stop, unfortunately. You've got War of Jenkins' Ear, which is also part of King George's War, and then you've got the French and Indian War, which, if you're familiar with the immediate lead up to the American Revolution and the taxation without representation that occurs. It's a product of that conflict. So 4 major world wars happen in just about a century. And in between each of these wars, there are fights with Native Americans and with pirates. You've got the golden age of piracy right here in the 1710s. You're probably familiar with Blackbeard blockading Charleston Harbor. You've got the Yamasee War, where the Native American Yamasee tribe nearly wipes out the colony of South Carolina. So is there any peace in this entire century, essentially? No. So the colonists realize that a lot of the time they have to build militias, the ancestor of our modern National Guard, obviously, but they also have to build provincial naval forces at great cost and at great length, because the British Royal Navy is not everywhere all at once. Even in the modern day, a navy can't be everywhere all at once, but especially in the age of sail, it's not possible, and it's not necessarily something the Crown was interested in. They wanted the colonists to defend themselves, as we saw in that royal charter from King Charles I. Why? Because it's cheaper. It's cheaper if those American colonists defend themselves than us having to send our tax base, our military, our standing military to go defend them. And that's ultimately one of the legacies of the 7 Years' War that will leave us with those big taxes that we're talking about now, the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. But the American colonists did most of the heavy lifting for self-defense and on land and on sea throughout this entire period. So who are they fighting? They're fighting the French. They're fighting the Spanish. Of course, the Spanish are only a couple colonies away from here. The Spanish were seen as an existential threat by the people in England and in English Carolina. Why? Well, number one, you got St. Augustine. They've got a lot of Native American allies, but they're also encouraging the escape of African slaves and white indentured servants from the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia and offering them refuge in St. Augustine if they run away. So they see Spanish Florida not only as a military enemy, but as an existential threat to the racial and social order in South Carolina. So no wonder they built a navy just to fight the Spanish in Florida. Also, pirates, as we've said, big problem in South Carolina. We liked them until they started attacking us. Then we had an issue with them. And Native Americans, especially the Yamasee tribe, will have a maritime force at their disposal. They were a sea-going Native American group. So we have an Indian war at sea, which is not your classic kind of John Wayne Western movie where Native Americans are fighting cowboys on land. This is a naval war in some respects. So that's something that doesn't get enough press coverage. So let's start with one of my favorite stories from my book. And I think that y'all will enjoy it too. It also involves the Salem witchcraft trials, which is appropriate for Halloween. So, the Sloop Mary. The Sloop Mary was one of several vessels built by the governor. There was a very bad attempt by the Crown in the 1680s to basically combine all of the northeastern colonies into one mega colony. It was called the Dominion of New England. Can you imagine today trying to govern the states of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire all together? It wouldn't work out. And I say this as someone who lived in New England, loved New England, but those state governments not going to all want to be under one umbrella. It didn't work today, it wouldn't work back then either, and there's a lot of hostility. But there was an attempt by the governor of this temporary mega colony called the Dominion of New England to build a provincial navy to guard, New England's coastline from the nearby French and Canada, as well as their Wabanaki Native American allies. So one of these vessels that was built was the Sloop Mary. And what do we mean by a sloop? A sloop is a single-masted vessel, very small. If you were to look at this in terms of cargo carrying capacity, she's 40, 50 tons. I've heard sloops referred to as the 18-wheelers of the Atlantic world. This is the most common vessel that you would have seen in Charleston Harbor, that you would have seen in Boston Harbor. Very utilitarian. It's also useful for military and civilian purposes. It had a crew of a few dozen people, relatively small vessel that gets to be an international point of contention and a superstar. Its original captain will be charged with attempted piracy, and he goes on the run, and his men on this sloop are sent to hunt him down, and they engage in a big battle. And they do capture him off of what is called Martin's Vineyard, which today is known as Martha's Vineyard. I'm not sure why the name changes. But they capture him, so they have to go after their former captain for being a pirate. Additionally, one of my favorite characters from the Sloop Mary is a guy by the name of John Alden. Has anyone here been to Salem, Massachusetts before? If you go there to the Witchcraft Museum, you'll see the name John Alden pops up as one of the people who was tried for sorcery. He was an accused witch. How do you get to be a captain of a Navy vessel, as a man especially? People forget there were a couple of men accused, including Giles Corey. How do you get to be accused of witchcraft? Well, it turns out that during the 1660s, 70s, and 80s, while he was a merchant captain, he had done some under-the-table trading with the French. And he had been a little less than honest with some of his dealings, which is, not very uncommon in the 1600s. And there was a lot of people who thought he was a traitor. And they accused him of everything from allying himself with Native Americans that were hostile to the colony, all the way up to working with the devil. And in the Puritan mindset of the time, there was a very thin line between those two things. Anyone who stood against Puritan Massachusetts was, in their mind, working with Satan. So you can see why during the witch craze that happens, he's an easy target. As an older man, he was in his 60s or 70s by this point, which in the 17th century was very much on the older side of who had been a naval captain. And he escapes from the Salem witchcraft trials through an open window. In this picture, you see him basically staring down. This is him right here. He's staring down one of the girls who is accusing him of sorcery. And he called her bluff and said that this is ridiculous. He's lucky to have escaped with his life. Now, another thing about the Salute Mary is that the colony of Massachusetts claimed it, but the colony of New York also claimed it. So King William had to arbitrate these two colonies fighting over this small little boat. So just in review so far, we've got a boat that was used in Indian diplomacy to hunt pirates, including one of its former captains, had an accused witch as another captain, and was a point of an international dispute. I mean, how is this not a movie? And this is all just, I love the Salute Mary. I went to Salem almost just to pay homage to John Alden, to go and see even just his name. But this is a story that does not get enough press coverage whatsoever. And it involves pirates, it involves witches, and it involves coastal defense. And also, this is during a time period when England is at war with France. During the period that the Salute Mary was in use, the colony of New England tries to invade, or the colonies of New England rather, tries to invade Quebec, and they are defeated very badly. And that defeat will leave New England in so much debt that they actually end up printing the first ever paper money in the Americas to pay off their soldiers and sailors, which, think about the fiat currency that was with high inflation. So we've got a lot of very interesting things going on, and we can look at the connections between all of them in matters of the provincial navies, which is a maritime window we haven't really considered before. So on to Charlestown, my hometown. So anyone here walked around downtown Charleston before? Oh, I hope most of you. This is what it used to look like. That's East Bay Street right there. Used to be right on the water. That's Broad Street going in the middle. That's Water Street, and that's the city market right here and Market Street. So, which used to be a creek and sometimes still is, depending on how much rain we get. You can kayak through it. 4 blocks long, about 2 blocks wide. Very small town. We were the 4th largest city in English America. We were originally governed by, if you know your South Carolina history, not by the Crown, but by a group of men called the Lords Proprietors. They were given a land grant by the namesake of Charlestown, King Charles II. And these men, including Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Berkeley, Lord Colleton, these men will be the Lords Proprietors who will indirectly govern the colony. They rarely will come over to the New World. So the colonists get into all kinds of trouble without too much supervision, including illicit Indian slave trading with pirates, and getting into all kinds of trouble. But eventually, being a bad neighbor that we were in the city of Charlestown, we built a walled city because of fights with the Spanish, the French, and Native Americans. By the early 1700s, once we get to this period of major imperial wars that we talked about a second ago, right here, Queen Anne's War, the locals realized they need a mobile fighting force to patrol local inlets for runaway enslaved people, to capture Native Americans who are hostile to the colony, including the Yamasee, who have a force of canoes called periaugers, and they build what's known as the Scout Boat Navy. I was first brought to this topic by discovering a book written by a Vietnam veteran named Larry Ivers. And it's a book called This Torrent of Indians. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And he has a chapter dedicated to these scout boat sailors. These men are basically in long canoes. And I believe that do y'all still have a dugout canoe in the museum here, or am I? Historic Camden. Okay, it's pretty similar to that. These are long, hollowed-out trunks with swivel guns. They're not a Navy in the traditional sense. They might be more like a Coast Guard cutter. And they are patrolling the inlets and the marshes of the Low Country in Beaufort, looking for runaway slaves, looking for Native Americans, and occasionally pirate hunting. So we'll have a state-funded, long-standing fleet for 60 years, the Scout Boat Navy, and all the sailing canoes of it are doing kind of police work on the southern frontiers of South Carolina. But also we're going pirate hunting, because eventually those pirates that we welcomed in our port start attacking us. They typically do that. Can't really trust them to be consistent. They go where the money is. The pirate Blackbeard will blockade Charleston Harbor. He will be killed by the British Navy, but we fit out our own Navy that I mentioned earlier at the beginning, led by Colonel William Rhett, and he has about 100 or so men with him. They are merchant sailors that were impressed to go hunting. They capture the pirate Stede Bonnet. Now, I could say a lot about Stede Bonnet, but I'd be wasting my breath. He wasn't much of a pirate. His career was nicknamed, rightfully so, the Gentleman Pirate. He allegedly was unable to sail. He was supposed to be kind of a dandy. Blackbeard took advantage of him for a while. Well, Stede Bonnet puts up a big fight, and the South Carolina Provincial Navy that had been put together captures him in the Battle of the Capes off of Cape Fear River. This is a painting of this engagement. You see a merchant sloop fighting the Stede Bonnet sloop right here. They capture him, they bring him to Charleston, and after a botched escape attempt, he's hanged publicly. But what happens next is really interesting. We got to figure out a way to pay for the sailors who just were forced to go pirate hunting. How do we pay them? We let them keep the proceeds of the recaptures they make, including they captured an enslaved man who had escaped from slavery in South Carolina, and he was recaptured on Stede Bonnet's ship, and they sell him, and they use the proceeds of that sell to pay the sailors off. So they're enslaving one person to pay off sailors. Also, they charge a rescue fee to some of the victims of Stede Bonnet. That seems kind of piratical, doesn't it? They're not able to pay it, and what happens to their ships? They're auctioned off, and they use the proceeds to pay the sailors. So you can really see some piratical-like ways of paying back our provincial navy. Who the good guys are, quote unquote, is always the question in these situations when we go pirate hunting, but yet we end up seizing civilian ships and selling people to pay off the debts we owe the sailors. It really is a morally gray episode in South Carolina history, but one that's very interesting. So who's ruling us in this period? A little pop quiz. Who's controlling South Carolina?
British.
Yeah, the British. If we zoom in on who, though? The proprietors. We're kind of angry at them. They haven't been doing a good job protecting us. We're spending all this money on these navies and all our militias. There's an Indian war that nearly wipes out the colony of South Carolina in 1715. So one of the reasons it's given for rebelling against them, we actually have a coup. Long before the American Revolution, they say South Carolina has had 3 rebellions in its history. The most well-known one is, of course, the Civil War. The second one, going further back, is the American Revolution. The first one was the coup that happens against the Lords Proprietors in 1719. And the stated published complaint that was higher than any other was that they weren't paying for us to defend our coast. They weren't paying for our military. So the cost of provincial naval defense is so high on the taxes in our colony that we're struggling to maintain it and to pay off these sailors. So one of the reasons that we rebel and ask for King George I to give us a royal governor is because we're so upset at the lack of protection we have from the Lords Proprietors. So we see a provincial navy causing, in part, a coup. This is a big deal, rebelling against the men who were put in charge of our colony 50 years earlier. South Carolina will get a royal governor, and allegedly we'll have protection now from who? Now that we have a royal governor. What's that? Allegedly, you're right. Who gets to protect us now that we have a royal governor? The Royal Navy, yeah, except they don't. Not very well, anyway. It's sort of a paper reality. The royal ships that, quote-unquote, guard South Carolina don't do a terribly effective job, which is exactly why we have to keep building our own fleets. This is a list of provincial naval vessels put together by General Oglethorpe, who's the founder of this colony of Georgia. And if you look at this list right here, he calls them armed rowboats. He has the colony periagua, which that's kind of a periagua. It's an armed vessel. It's actually more of a galley. That is a dugout canoe. A guard to coast, which is he's calling it a Coast Guard vessel. You've got a scout boat, which we've already talked about, and there's some different scout boats here. And he lists the sailors and what the personal costs are. This is the colony of Georgia, but some of these men are from South Carolina too. And he's paying for these out of his own pocket. He's keeping track of it because he's going to go to Parliament in the 1740s and say, hey, I've spent all this money on defending your colony and your coastline. You owe me money. He eventually does get reimbursed by Parliament. But South Carolina and Georgia, despite having protection from the Royal Navy, rarely could depend on these forces alone. One of the reasons is the Royal Navy captains were, I hate to say men with egos, but they could be men with egos. We had cases of battles between governors of South Carolina and station captains over strategy, over how best to defend the coast. And at times they were forced to impress sailors to just fit out their own men on their own ships. There's a lot of tension between Royal Navy and Provincial Navy leadership. At one point, there is a joint expedition that involves the British Navy, the South Carolina Provincial Navy, and the militia forces of both colonies, and they attempt to attack St. Augustine, Florida. It goes so poorly that it is I've seen studies from modern military publications, because one of the things that military historians do today is look at how joint operations have failed throughout human history, and the title of the book was An Opportunity Gone Awry. So this is a classic case of when the different forces don't work well together. Henry Lawrence, you may have heard that name before. He's a South Carolina founding father. He would go on to be president of the Continental Congress in the 1770s after John Hancock. But as a young man, he was kind of a fashionable young Charleston businessman. He wrote a letter in the 1740s when the colony expanded its provincial navy, and he said something to the effect of, the Royal Navy is now out of fashion in South Carolina. Almost like a Paris fashion. It's out of fashion. We are building our own fleet to guard our coast. That's not to say we're not working with the Royal Navy. That's not to say we still don't want their help more than our own, but there's a realization that they're not sufficient to take on the full might of the Spanish Empire or the French or whoever we're fighting at the time. So even Henry Lawrence, who will later on be an influential founding father, is seeing the necessity as a young man, just like Benjamin Franklin had as a middle-aged man in Philadelphia, of building a fleet. So if what you're seeing is the kernels of a future American Navy, I hope that's what the message that I'm getting across here. This is what Charleston Harbor looked like in that war called the War of Jenkins' Ear in the 1730s and 40s. You notice all these merchant vessels. These are vessels that are the bread and butter of the provincial navies. That's the walled city of Charlestown. And these are two clippings of mentions of the Scout Boat Navy and the Provincial Navy in local papers in Charleston. So even in our newspapers, the South Carolina Gazette mentions these navies. To give you an example, up here, on Saturday last returned from the cruise against the Spaniards, the Rose, which is a Royal Navy frigate, HMS Rose, and Swift, men of war, and the Beaufort Galley. The Beaufort Galley was a long vessel that was stationed in Beaufort, South Carolina, and actually that's very similar to that vessel that you see up there, a row galley. It's actually based off of ancient Roman and Greek ship designs. If you know your classical history at all, they used galleys way back in the Mediterranean world. Except they didn't have gunpowder like we did with the Beaufort Galley. So down here, you see a classic case of South Carolina and Georgia not getting along. Georgia accused South Carolina of not supporting their military enough during the war, and this op-ed from the South Carolina Gazette said, we've put a large sum of money to build them forts for their security. I say all this has been done for them besides our scout boats as well as our horse rangers supported by the Carolinians. So this is a classic state versus state rivalry, or colony versus colony rivalry, and we're using the cost of naval defense to say we've helped Georgia out. We've done our share to establish this new frontier colony. So this may not be over barbecue sauce, but this is a classic old Southern battle. Whose state is doing more for the common cause? So we are arguing that we have done a lot in this newspaper article to support Georgia. So where was the Royal Navy in all of this is the question that I keep asking in my book. One of the questions is they do have ships. They are present. I'm not trying to imply that they're not present, that they're not working hard. There's a lot of good scholarship on Royal Navy ships. In fact, Nick Butler in Charleston has a podcast called Charleston Time Machine. He does an entire episode just on Royal Navy station ships in Charlestown. So don't misinterpret what I'm saying as to imply there was no Royal Navy. I'm just saying they weren't doing their full job. They weren't a sufficient security force to protect South Carolinians, Massachusetts, New Hampshireans, wherever you go, Barbadians from threats posed by the Spanish, the pirates, the French, etc. Why is that? Well, number one, this is the 18th century. Creating an international fighting force is hard in the day of nuclear propulsion. It's much harder in the age of sail, but also money, limited state capacity, and also corruption. There is an issue with some Royal Navy ship captains being corrupt. That is something that's not uncommon. The colonies might also be expecting too much. In some cases, they ask for the crown to defend them, and they only kind of stubbornly pull out a provincial navy when they have to. I guess that's human nature, though. There's also tensions with Royal Navy captains and local crews, and the colonies are oftentimes upset that the Royal Navy is there to protect them, but then asks them in return for sailors. It's sort of you can't have your cake and eat it too. So it's a very toxic relationship between the Royal Navy and local leaders that leads to a lot of misunderstandings. Sometimes they work well together, sometimes they don't. This is a clipping from the ship log of HMS Flamborough, which guarded Charleston Harbor. If you want to take a good nap, read ship logs. I went through the British archives a few summers in a row, reading through these and scanning them. I had a lot of fun, but don't try to read them. They are going to tell you which way the wind blows, which way the traffic light turns. That's about as interesting as it gets. It's not meant to be a riveting read, but it tells you exactly the latitude and longitude these men are at, their enemies, who died. It's very useful, but it's also very analytic. So, how do we get to the American Revolution? Which, I mean, we're all thinking that I hope we're the 250th anniversary of our Navy. The scout boat Prince George was a scout boat in Georgia that was still in service when the Revolutionary War occurs. And it will be fought over by both British and American crews. It'll be fought over back and forth. So there is at least one surviving provincial Navy ship that from the colonial times it's still being fought over. It's sort of an old veteran. There's also the fact that the Prince George was used by the royal governor to bring in stamps during the Stamp Act crisis. So you're seeing a direct tie-in to the imperial crisis that leads to the Stamp Act. So the other thing about the provincial navies of the colonial era is that there were at least some older veterans who served in both the provincial navies of the colonial times and in the continental navy or the state navies of the Revolution. For those that don't know, we had three naval forces in the American Revolution. We had the ancestor of the U.S. Navy, the Continental Navy, who's controlled by Congress. We had state navies, of which South Carolina State Navy is the focus of my next book project. And then we had privateers, who we've kind of already discussed. Of those three, who do y'all think was the most successful? Privateers. Oh, yeah. Nobody wants to sign up for a navy when you can sign up for a pirate crew that gets legal permission. So constant battle over manpower. Now, the Captain John Joyner, if you go to the State Museum, the Confederate Relic Room, there's actually now more Revolutionary War exhibits, and they have a bell from the frigate South Carolina, which very famous frigate. It actually never made it to South Carolina for very long. It was a ship of the State Navy of South Carolina, and there's a whole great drama and history behind that vessel. But its captain was John Joyner, who was a former captain of the Scout Boat Navy. So he as a young man, he was a captain of the provincial scout boats in Beaufort, and as an older man in his 60s, he was a captain of this big frigate during the Revolutionary War that took part in some late war operations. So we see an exact service record from some provincial captains, not a whole lot, but enough to see a connection. But we also see the founding fathers themselves drawing comparisons and inspiration from provincial navies of the colonial times for the U.S. Navy. One of my favorite quotes that I've pretty much committed to memory is from John Adams. John Adams, as an older man, when he was writing a few letters to friends, he said that someone needs to write a conclusive history of the U.S. Navy, and then the part where it's a quote, the history of which would go back to the province ship King George, or further still backwards. That is talking about the colonial naval ship, the Prince George, that defended Massachusetts in the early 1700s. So he is actually, as one of the founders of the Continental Navy, he is one of the biggest supporters, saying, I can see where the line goes back to the early 18th century. So even he, one of the foremost authorities on the thing that he helped create, is saying there's this connection from the colonial times and our naval defenses of that period straight through to the Revolution and beyond. So when I was in Philadelphia and we were doing the 250th anniversary, I was at a conference, and one of the things I told some of the folks that were there, including an admiral I met with, was maybe we could talk about the start of the U.S. Navy in the 1600s. Maybe we can go further back to, and of course it was a joke, but I did mean that the roots of this naval tradition we have are much older than just the Revolutionary War. They go back, and our founding fathers recognized it. The men who served in these fleets recognized it. So that is what I like to hope is the carrying main argument of my book. So with that being said, this is where I will stop talking your ears off, and I would like to see, is it okay if I ask for questions? Or and I will say, shameless plug, if anyone would like to grab a book, I'm happy to autograph it. I know they're selling them right over here with you're with Books and Broad, right? And also, there's an ebook version too, and an Audible version. I haven't listened to the Audible version, but I was just excited that someone made it into an audiobook. Which I'm sure they read it a lot more interestingly than I possibly could have. So, but thank you all so much for having me.
How would people get a hold of you?
They can reach me. My email is at Schaffer, Schaffer, historian, HISTORIAN, @gmail.com.